Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I time travel back and revisit almost every live show I've ever seen from 1975 to the present. Here are 10 random facts about London, Ontario, my hometown. 1. We were almost the capital of Canada. 2. We are known as the Forest City, and we are indeed lucky to have a profusion of sylvan treasures citywide. 3. Jack Warner of Warner Brothers Studios was born here on August 2nd, 1892. 4. Guy Lombardo was born in London 10 years later, in 1902. 5. London is home to Storybook Family Theme Park, Storybook Gardens, located at 1958 Storybook Lane in magnificent Springbank Park. There are pictures on the internet of Susie Quattro visiting Storybook Gardens in 1968. 6. Also in 1968, Johnny Cash proposed to June Carter at the London Gardens in the city's South End. 7. And again in 68, London had the second franchise McDonald's open in Canada, the first in Eastern Canada, with the Oxford Street West location. 8. From 1959 to 1984, London had the highest concentration of per capita serial killers of anywhere in the world. 9. For many decades, London was a test market. By the way, those last 2 points were linked. And 10. Outside of the Toronto region, London had the biggest, earliest, and most thriving punk scene in Ontario. And this podcast looks back on a night that was part of that world in the latter 70s. Stay tuned for pogoing, bitchery, the police arriving to shut down a gig, and, as Happy Mondays put it, pills and thrills and belly aches. Hey everyone, I'm your host, Various Artists. This is the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast, and welcome to episode 13, concert number 5. It's my last ticketed gig of the wild, halcyon, and wonderful 1970s, and this episode is entitled, What's in the City? NFG's second annual Halloween Bash with the Regulators and Sinners at the Polish Hall, London, Ontario, Canada, Friday, November 2nd, 1979, with added Cedar Lounge. More on that in a bit. Just a reminder to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We also have the My Life in Concert YouTube channel featuring related vids I've shot or digitized along with versions of the podcast episodes. I also have a Spotify account under my pen name, Various Artists, with playlists related to My Life in Concert episodes, including one that's there today with sort of all the stuff I was listening to throughout 1979. And I have a bunch of other playlists there, and they all can be found. They start with the prompt. They start with MLIC, followed by a prompt. So you can search for them that way if Various Artists is too difficult to find. And, of course, there's the MyLifeInConcert.com website. And certainly if you've been to any of the gigs that I've talked about or what I'm talking about today or will be talking about, certainly go to any of those platforms. Share your memories. What do you recall about the events? I've been having that through when I was just writing this as a blog, and now as a podcast, people are starting to share their memories from some of these events, and it's great to get that communication going. Okay, since launching the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast 10 months ago, I've revisited and talked about live shows that have happened at venues of varying sizes, with the biggest being the 2 festivals I've discussed. Episode 10, I looked at the Heatwave Festival in 1980 with the Talking Heads, Elvis Costello, B-52s, the Pretenders, and among others. Among the others is also Hamilton/Toronto's Teenage Head. And I'd just like to mention there's a brand new documentary, I think it was on TVO the other week, on Teenage Head, but there's a new documentary out, so that's one I want to see, and just to sort of let people know that's out there. That was the biggest show. I think there was like 70. There's always been an issue of how many people were there in the evening, 70 to 100,000. But anyway, and then episode 4 was Lollapalooza 92 with Ministry, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and others. And I've also talked about some of the big arena shows. Of course, the David Bowie concert in 2004. That was episode 5. And then in episode 6, Leonard Cohen in 2012. And both of those were out at that big place out in the Canada Boonies in Ottawa that has that constantly evolving corporate name. And even the first 2 proper gigs, were in large hockey arenas. Episode 2, I looked at the first show I ever saw, Roxy Music at the London Arena in 1975. And Episode 7, Bob Seger at the London Gardens, an even bigger place in the south end of the city in 1978. Now, I've also discussed shows in more standard size 2000-ish Cedar theaters, such as Episode 3 with the Ramones and the Demics at Centennial Hall in 1980. We'll be mentioning their name again in a moment. And also Episode 8, Elvis Costello at Alumni Hall in November 78, my third gig proper, as it were. Now, my fourth sequential concert and previous episode was on the Jam's Toronto appearance in April 79 at the Rex Danforth Theatre. That was Episode 12. Now, in it, I talked about how much I loved the intimacy of this smaller venue. And I think this theater is like 900 to 1,000 people. So certainly this was the smallest gig I had seen at this time. So I'd gone from hockey arenas to a concert hall to a small theater. And with the gig I'm talking about today, with this episode, the venue size shrinks right down. Now, there's going to be a lot of episodes in the series coming up that will be taking place, again, in many large to massive venues over the last 40 years. And as I've mentioned, I can appreciate shows of all different sizes for different reasons. And also, too, it depends on the artist, and that sort of thing. Now, this episode 13 marks the start of a new phase in my musical life, which started in 79 and remained a key part of my life right through the early 90s. Namely, this was a night out at a small venue taking in the most popular local bands from the London, Ontario scene. This was pretty much a chunk of my life and time over the next decade plus. This gig specifically featured 3 then local bands and took place 7 months after the Jam's superb set at the Rex in April. Now, during the intervening summer, a key development had occurred in my gig-going life, namely my first visits to the local punk rock club. It was an appropriately destitute downtown establishment, the Cedar Lounge, formerly the Blue Boot. Now, at that time, the legal drinking age in Ontario was 18, changing to the current 19 shortly before my 18th birthday. And so I was going in underage. And my older siblings were taking me in with their friends on the scene who I knew through them. And so years ago, they were taking me to Roxy Music gigs. Now they were sneaking me in underage to punk rock clubs. I guess the reason I'm focusing on this Polish Hall gig rather than the one in the summer, going to the Cedar Lounge a few times to see some bands, is I have a ticket for this one, and that way I can put it up on the website. Down the road, episode number 30, I'm going to be doing an episode called Domestic Animals, where I'm going to look at the scene in general here in London, say from the late 70s to the mid-80s, and then even further down the line, I'm doing one sort of mid-80s to early 90s. But I'll be going more in depth about the scenes and the variety of bands at that time. I'm also looking for people from the London scene who would be interested in being interviewed and sharing their memories, because I also want to create a bit of a social history and use that episode as a starter. So that's probably about a year or two away, about 2 years away, a year and a half away or whatever, till I get to it. So I'll be talking about it a little later on. If you're from the scene, was around at that time, and have some memories to share, get a hold of me through the website, Facebook, YouTube, or info@mylifeinconcert.com. But I'll talk a little, and the reason I'm, again, picking the Polish Hall gig is I have the ticket. I'm not really going to be focusing on individual gigs by local bands, since I saw many of the local bands many, many times. So I'm going to save it more for then. But I will say that going into the Cedar Lounge in the late summer was an incredible experience. Again, this is at the Polish Hall where this gig took place. I'm not going to be talking about in a little bit. Again, it was more like a small venue. Being in the bar was different. It was about 150 people. You could get in there, and it was just a great environment. And it was great to hear the bands, be close to the bands, And something I'm going to reiterate is it was a very social environment, which is something that gets missed out of a lot of the history of punk rock, is the social aspect. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But it was an incredible experience to finally be part of this, since I've been following from the beginning. And then several months later, I got to go to this gig at the Polish Hall, which was a little bit bigger because it was a small hall. But regardless, this going to see gigs, and later I'd see NFG at the York. It later became called the Office, and it was the legendary York. So I saw some of these early gigs, but it was hard for me. I'll talk about this in a bit. I'll come back to it. Now, I actually reached out to people about this show, and I did talk to a number of people who had been there, but they had no clear memories of this specific gig. Whereas I do. And I think the reason is easy. By this point, most of the people who were sort of on the scene, as it were, this was just another night out, and one of several, and one of many times seeing these bands. Whereas for me, of course, it was a special affair because it was one of my first nights out. Now, of course, as the years would go on, I'd be in the same position. There's bands down the line like Sheep Look Up, who I probably saw 100 times. So it's hard to discern one from the other, as it were. And while I'm on the topic of connecting, there's also Heatwave. I want to do an oral history of Heatwave for the 41st anniversary coming up this August. I did a big episode on that and have connected with a number of people who were there. So also, if you were at Heatwave, once again, info@mylifeinconcert.com or in any of the online channels. So back to this gig. Now, on this night, again, I came in with a crowd of my siblings and their friends, some of who were now friends of mine at that period, and I was getting to know them. And although I hadn't been to see many of the shows because I couldn't, I'd been to some of the parties, places, downtown hangouts where the punk scenesters were congregating. So at both the Cedar Lounge and this Polish Hall gig, the door check guys must have just figured, well, he's coming in with these people, he must be of age, or either they just didn't care. It could be maybe a mixture of both. But that's the only way I was going to get into any of these places. I've always tended to look younger than my years, which now that I'm older, I'll take that, thank you. But when I was younger and trying to get into bars and be part of the scene, it was a real pisser, because even when I turned 19, I got carded for a number of years because I looked just a little bit younger. So again, it's something you revere when you get older, but when you're younger, it's like, damn. So getting into a bar on your own was not something that would be easy for me to do unless I came in with older people. And it was a switch time in London. It really became a lot more interesting at this point in time. Now, it had been in the 60s. There was the whole history of the London art scene in the 60s. But in the late 70s, things became a lot more interesting. You had some of the more independent shops that were sort of around, like City Lights, and the punk scene happening. And also one big thing that I always remember from the same time was the New Yorker cinema opening here in August of 79. Finally, we had a rep cinema in town. And I remember going to my first R-rated movie in October of that year, specifically Clockwork Orange. And I actually have the New Yorker's first month, August 79 schedule framed and up on my wall. So I sort of remember all that coming around at the same time. And a lot of the people who were involved in the punk scene were creative, into the arts. So they were going to see a lot of movies at the theater. So it was kind of a real alternative community, and sort of alternative network was starting in London at this time, or at least advancing or reblossoming. Actually, while on the subject of sort of the London scene at that time and the blossoming and the punk scene, I have to mention a fantastic book that was put out a number of years ago, curated by Brian Lambert, put together and written by Brian Lambert, Graphic Underground, London 1977 to 1990. And it's a history of a lot of the handbills and posters, artwork, that sort of thing related to the scene. And it's just an invaluable document, especially as time now begins to pass, and this gets further and further into the past. And There's so many posters and handbills on here that I remember around the city from the time, but I don't know how available the book still is, but certainly if this is the London scene and that sort of thing I'm talking about today is of interest in you, definitely get a copy of this book. It's just fantastic. It's a real memory trip and beautifully put together. Also with contributions from other people from the scene. And actually, I got the handbill for the Cedar Lounge show in the summer and for a couple for the Polish Hall gig. I scanned in from the book and I put those up on the blog. So again, as I was saying, the reason I'm focusing on this gig is I still have the originating ticket. And I've got a copy of that up on the blog. And it looks very much like a business card more than a concert ticket, which is probably because how they were printed up and they need to be done cheaply. But I'm really pleased to both possess a memento of a night like this, as well as get a chance to talk about this, talk about the era, talk about the scene. Because while none of these groups necessarily went on to become big stars, these kinds of evenings became central, ongoing experiences in my younger life, and certainly in the lives of many others in this city who were marginalized in some way, or who were about to be via punk rock. London's a really conservative place. I don't think that's ever going to fundamentally change. It's in the city's DNA. But because of that, London has always had a counterpoint as well, going back to the boho York Tavern and a lot of the radical art and artists from the 60s, including not least of which the one-of-a-kind experimentalists, the nihilist Spasm Band, and all coming out of that earlier era. And, when you come from a place as aggressively normative and passive-aggressive as London can be, and you don't fit the mold for whatever reason, having an alternative and an outlet becomes a lifeline to sanity. Having enclaves of creative oxygen is truly important and essential. London has always had that counterpoint, that counteraction to the predominating mindset. So there's always been really interesting aspects to London as well, and like I certainly know the neighborhood I live in, I love it. I won't say where it is, but it's very diverse, but London generally isn't like that. It's very, very segmented. That was the reason we were a test market. You have to have a lot of social isolation for a test market to work. Actually, on this subject, here's another book to plug. I'm plugging a lot of books today, but that's a good thing. Reading's great. Well, the other one was more of a picture book, so looking and reading is great. This has got to be one of the best books I've ever read about London. It came out a few years ago, and it's called Murder City: The Untold Story of Canada's Serial Killer Capital, 1959 to 1984, by criminologist and former beat cop Michael Arntfield. Apart from the fact, just as a true crime book, it's just superb, incredibly well written. He really goes deep into the psychology of the city and the functioning and how that all plays out. It's just very, very fascinating, especially, again, delving into that predominating bedrock psychology and, unfortunately, how it played out with all these tragedies. And certainly I grew up in this era, and certainly from sort of the late 60s onward, I remember all of these murders happening. It was really scary to grow up in an environment with this going on. It really wasn't until I read this book that it also hit me how this really wasn't normal for most places. You might have like one of these people, but like at one point there was like, 6 different serial killers working in a city area of about 200,000 at the time. But anyway, it's an incredible book to read, very, very well written, and as I said, fascinating from start to finish. But I felt that I learned, even though it's focusing on this one thing, I felt I learned a lot about London through reading the book. And I'm not done plugging books today either, because in focusing back on the gig and on the scene, I was going to talk about how the unwanted appearance of punk rock in London, Ontario, happened concurrently with a proliferation of similar music scenes forming in cities and towns around the world at this time, following the shots that were fired from New York City and London primarily. Although in Toronto, a whole scene was starting completely independently and at the same time, with people coming from tapping into the same sources, the Stooges, Garage Rock, the Velvets. I think it was Malcolm McLaren, who I realized could be a Pratt, but he had some good ideas too. His whole thing of, I think I read it was him who said it, if an idea is really good, then several people are having it at the same time. And that was certainly the case there, except for we didn't have the media and connections with the Toronto scene to get. In fact, the Toronto scene weren't even completely aware of what was happening in these other cities at that time. But the book I was going to mention that sort of covers off the Toronto scene and also delves into what was happening in London is an absolutely brilliant oral history called Treat Me Like Dirt, an oral history of punk in Toronto and beyond 1977 to 1981. I think it's one of the best music biographies, and I love oral histories, and it's quite a read. It's a very thick book. Ultimately, it's pretty depressing because while a lot of that scene laid the groundwork for a lot that followed in the years ahead, a lot of those innovators and people who came first were really, really shafted, especially the story of the Diodes. It's heartbreaking. It's all these albums that were sold and in the States. But anyway, it's an incredible, incredible book about punk, the music and the Toronto scene that I couldn't recommend enough. Once again, Treat Me Like Dirt, an oral history of punk in Toronto and beyond, 77 to 81 by Liz Worth. And again, they go into the London scene a bit in it as well. So I'll end my bibliographic inclinations for today's episode. So anyway, these regional scenes, these mushrooming regional enclaves, they weren't simply about the music, but also function as social communities as well, providing reciprocal peer support of a type. It was a bit like a private club. Partially because, of course, the shared interest in the music and outsiderness and the whole culture around it, but also because of the intense hostility aimed at the community. Many of the media depictions at the time showed, sort of punk rock places as sort of this, sort of places of, just insane wanton violence, where the reality was a lot of this was just sensationalistic embellishments or lurid fantasies invented by some prude behind a typewriter, often completely missing most of the humor in the process. And the general public believed this shit. They just ate it up with a fork and spoon. I remember this high school classmate, actually one of the nicer people in my high school, but telling me with just complete concerned earnestness how she was horrified reading about, people were literally slamming their heads into wood beams and throwing broken glass in each other's faces, and how could I be involved with this? I just start laughing. It's funny for a second, but then it just sinks in like, do you actually believe this? You try to explain this isn't the case. It's just people who kind of like something edgier in their music and living. They want to be creative about how they dress. They're mostly creative people. And it was just high energy music, people bouncing around, getting off on the energy. And again, one of the things that I want to keep going back to is the social aspect. That's one of the things I really take away. It really connected a lot of people, and a lot of these nights were very, very social. And that was one of the key things. And that, again, the humor, just sort of the unique, a lot of this stuff just got bulldozed by a media that just completely got it wrong. So, she came back with, well, this is in the paper and I'm reading this, and if this was true, why wouldn't they, why would they be writing it? And it's like, oh my God, because this crap is dreamt up as media fodder for, the naive and gullible. And it's like, again, people just ate it up. And really what it was way more, we're having fun hanging out and being with our own kind. It was more like, the Cedar Lounge was kind of like the punk rock union hall, as it were, something like that, a meeting place where people come together that liked the music but had different perspectives. And this was sort of a place unlike anything else in the city. While the scene, it could, be aggressive, excessive, certainly from a drug and alcohol perspective, it wasn't violent in that way that it got depicted. Maybe it was a bit different in Toronto, but not in London. And, the violence came from the outside with rednecks and frat boys, who we generally refer to as wankers, out to beat up, punks and start trouble. That was the reality. It was we just kind of wanted to do our thing, but it was this heavy provocation from, again, a place as normative as London and as straight-jacketed as London. But, and the fact that people felt so threatened by this, it made you want to dig your heels in all the more. And certainly this was a part of me becoming a lot more confident, because to go out, and I mean, I look back now, it was how I was dressed. It's like a leather jacket, buttons, and I have shortish hair and non-flared jeans. That was about it, and running shoes. But it was so radical and disrupting to people where it's like, let's all be sheeples. Now, I'll also note that there were also rednecks and closed-minded, quote-unquote, purists and traditionalists part of that community as well. I mean, there's always going to be jerks. But for me, that wasn't what predominated, at least at that point. And they weren't the people I was drawn to anyway. To be honest, the biggest negatives in that scene were fairly standard with things that occur with scenes of any type that get established. You have cliques within cliques, rivalries, and general bitchiness. And this is all the stuff I've just completely, I don't have the time of day for it. But, people are people at the end of the day. And sadly, a lot of the sort of like bitchy gossip stuff seems inevitable with a lot of these scenes. I try to avoid it like gangrene. So anyway, I had gone to a few of the gigs at the Cedar Lounge, as I mentioned, and some of the parties and that, but this was me going to a new venue. And as I talked about earlier, the venues had gotten smaller. This was at the Polish Hall on Ann Street in the northwest area of the core. And I go past this place all the time on my long distance walks and runs, several times a week in the warmer months. And I took a picture of it about 10 years ago for the blog, and I've taken a new one. And as you'll see, it's barely changed. It's barely changed since I was there that night in 1979. So it's kind of neat to have some of these places that are almost like frozen in time. Back to this point, by this point, the first and best known band to come out of the London scene, the Demics, had released their excellent debut EP, Talks Cheap, and you can hear that. It's on Spotify online, the spring in 1979, and then they relocated to Toronto. So I never got to see the Demics in their club prime here in London, but did see them open for the Ramones a few months later in May of 1980, and I've talked about that in episode 3. Now, as for the Polish Hall itself, the venue, it was a bit like a high school gymnasium with a stage, that kind of size, or maybe public school, elementary school gymnasium with a stage. It was used for a number of punk gigs in the upcoming years, a few of which I attended. Actually, I was at a gig there a few weeks after that. So this was my last ticketed gig of the 70s, but there was one more a couple of weeks later. Now, as I mentioned, the ticket is kind of like that. It looks like a business card, and it says on it, it's the second annual Halloween Bash. Although I don't really recall people being in costume myself, but I notice online a few people have posted photos from that night with a few people dressed up. And also it was November 2nd. I guess they didn't want to do it a week earlier, but still it's, when you try to have a Halloween thing just a couple of days after, it never quite works. So it was a Halloween bash, but I don't remember anyone being there in a Jabberwocky costume or anything like that, That's probably erasure from my mind. I just kind of remember people being there in their standard, leather jacket, and jeans and leather and whatever. Now, as for the bands that were on, NFG, they were the headliners. NFG stands for No Fucking Good. And they were started by a couple of guys who really spearheaded the London scene. And at this point, NFG had probably taken over from Demics as the big band in the city. NFG definitely had a strong New York Dolls style influence to their sound and comportment. And they'd later morph into the much better known 63 Monroe. And a couple of them lived at this house in this suburban neighborhood. And I'd been to a party there where NFG were playing. And it's just hilarious because it was this quiet suburban street and you could hear the band, probably 2 blocks away. Sort of reminded me of that book on the Replacements that came out where Paul Westerberg said he would hear this band playing at concert pitch in this house, and it ended up being the people he would go on to form the Replacements with. Now, on before NFG were the Regulators and Sinners. Now, the Regulators were heavily influenced by Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, and they had that kind of sound. They also had a female keyboard player, which was a little unique among the groups in the city, and their repertoire also included a cover of a then bootleg-only VU track, I'm Sticking With You, and that impressed me that they were doing a bootleg. And actually, Regulators leader Jeff Morritt, he's one of the people who introduced me to the Velvet Underground, who I had been trying to hear for years, but the records were very hard to get. So thank you, Jeff, who is now deceased, for creating a lifelong love affair with that band. Probably my 3 favorites of all time would be the Beatles, Bowie, and VU. And on the Velvet Underground front, John Cale will be coming up, actually not too far along in this series. He's concert number 17 at Freifogels in June of 1983 here in London, and coming up again later in the 80s. And Lou Reed will be showing up in this series thrice. The Regulators also released their single, their one and only single, in the summer of 79. It had to be the second or third, one of the earliest pieces of vinyl from London. The Demic EP had come out in the late winter, early spring, and That's Right, Nothing's Left, and What's in the City, of course I've used that as the title of today's episode, was the Regulator single in the summer of 79 on Ready Records. That was a great little independent label that ran for a few years and released a lot of terrific albums and singles. Blue Peter were on Ready, a number of other artists, so that was another great thing to come out of London. Starting off the night was, well, they were known as Sinners, but I'll say the Sinners. We have to have that definite article in there. And they were more of a straight-ahead proposition in, say, the style of like The Jam or 999, something like that. And of course, last episode I was talking about The Jam's gig earlier that year. And they released their debut 45, a 3-track affair. The next summer, I think the next spring, No Brains Required. The B-side of the Sinner single features Attitude Is Everything and In With the New. Honestly, I can't remember any of the numbers or anything specific about the music from the evening, just that it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed the tunes. It was a good crowd that came out for the gig. It was pretty full in there, and everyone was pogoing and dancing around and having a jolly good time. Now, it also says on the ticket that there was a special guest. I think there was an opening band, but I can't for the life of me remember who it is. Also, there was another show at the Polish Hall. I can't remember who was on the bill. It was a few weeks after this. So even then, some of these memories might be a bit of a blur with that night. I'm pretty sure it was the next show. There was a band and they did a cover of XTC's Making Plans for Nigel, which was brand new at the time. And I thought, oh, that's impressive. This just came out. And that was before it became a massive hit here. Very shortly thereafter, it became a big, I think it was a top 10 hit here in Canada. Now, XTC were actually supposed to play here a year later, but unfortunately that never happened. That got canceled as XTC started canceling their touring. And I talk about that canceled gig in episode 9A, Waiting in Vain, 20 Performances I Missed. So I can't remember who that band is. I'm thinking Crash 80s may have played at one of these shows, an early gig. Or I saw them a year later at 1980 at an all-ages gig. They were a great live band from the scene and released a great 45 as well. So some of the remembrances I have may be a bit of a mix of this night and from a few weeks later. So again, I snuck in with the older crew because it was a licensed event, as I mentioned. But I also want to re-mention that because what really strikes me in looking back was, punk was supposed to be this teenage revolution thing. And when it took off in Britain, it largely was, but its origins on this side of the coin, on this side of the pond in New York, and certainly a lot of the people who first cottoned onto it over here were anything but. I knew no one of my age who was into any of this music, because the shows, these shows were being played in bars, which young people couldn't get into. And there was just such a massive resistance, huge resistance in the media, in the industry, by everyone to punk, that unless you knew about it, there was no way to hear it or track it down. You weren't going to hear it on the radio. It was a very underground thing. So it was older, alternative people who were really into that first wave of the scene. It would not be in any way unusual to have people sort of in their 30s who were part of the scene, but you had very, very few people who were, say, in their teens who were part of this at this point. That was about to change radically within the year, but not at this point. So it was kind of unusual over here for someone my age to really be into all this stuff, not to mention that I'd been reading and following it since its beginning. In fact, many of those same disaffected folks who had embraced Bowie, glam, and sort of that whole early 70s scene were also the same folks now getting behind punk in its initial phase. I wouldn't mind betting that half of the people at the Polish Hall that night had been to that Roxy Music gig that was my first show back in 75. Now, I don't know exactly what the factors are. Certainly, as I've discussed in a few episodes, sort of more the new wave end of the spectrum really broke big at the end of 79 and early and throughout 1980 here in Canada. In a way, it really didn't in the States. A couple of the bands got through, but it became much bigger here. So that could have been part of it. All I know is in 1980, there was a big change. And a lot more younger people started coming onto the scene, younger bands. And this is what really created this first big shift. In many ways, this gig that I'm looking at tonight was the end of an era, because this whole scene that had been brewing since the end of 77 here kind of fell apart and rejigged itself in 1980. And a lot of it were the kids, because you had these younger people coming in. And I know there was a lot of older people who were sort of like, this is my scene, or I'm resentful, or, you know, whatever. So a lot of those all ages shows and the new influx of a different kind of people coming in, that was part of the reason why some of the people sort of were pushed away. But that was still yet to happen. So I was one of the few underage people at these gigs, and it was okay. You know, I've always liked to, especially when I was younger, liked to party. Not so much these days, but when I was younger, and it was part of it and part of the scene. So there was a lot of alcohol, dope smoking, and popping speed pills, beans or bennies as we called them for my 16-year-old self. You know, and again, I can't really remember anything of the actual tunes. One memory that really jumps out at me, and that's the thing about looking back at these events, is the stuff you remember, is I remember talking to someone, and I had just bought the Specials Gangsters 45, one of the first import copies that came in, and I was telling them about it because I've been reading about it, and then it came on over the PA system, and it's like, here it is. I remember saying I'd be bringing it over with some other imports I just bought within the week. So, you know, that little bit of synchronicity. It's really weird what you remember. Like, there's all sorts of stuff that's wiped out, yet that's a memory that's always stayed with me. It's interesting how each of us process and recall events differently. And this is something I'll be exploring more in the next episode on the Boomtown Rats. It's actually one of the themes of that episode I'm going to be looking at. What I do recall most about the evening was how it ended. NFG were on stage, things were going well, the audience was bopping around wildly. Honestly, I can't remember what happened, but I think it was people at the hall got a little nervous. They thought people were getting violent, as I kind of recall that aspect. All I know is that all of a sudden the plug was pulled, the lights were turned up, and the show was over. And people had been having a great time, but when everything came to a sudden halt, the mood turned nasty. and it seemed like anger was going to boil over. People weren't going to leave, and if something bad hadn't happened before, it was about to. Word spread quickly that the police had been called and were on their way to quell any real or imagined problems. Since I didn't want my liquored up underage ass to get arrested, I decided that now was the time to split. So I jumped in the cab, returned home, tiptoeing into the house, careful not to awake my sleeping parents, both who had to work in the morning. And I remember waking up the next morning with a 9-point on the Richter scale hangover, spending most of the day slumped on the couch, feeling like death warmed over, in between trips to say hi to Ralph on the big white telephone. So all in all, an exciting and fitting end to my very first punk rock concert. A few weeks after this gig, and after the second gig I went to that I mentioned, some point in November, I met my first pals who were into punk and this thing, who were the same age as me. That was a first. Notably, Lady B and the unfortunately late Count Mara, both of whom I discussed in the Ramones episode 3. And they both became key people in my social life over the next few years, gradually swelling into an ever-growing network of friends and acquaintances where music and gig-going became one of our primary bonds. So this might have been a big night out for me at this point in time, but in short order, going to bars, spending nights out seeing bands of all stripes would just become a normal weekly occurrence and ritual in my life, particularly once the 80s really got going. Not so much the next year or two, but after that it really boomed. So as I mentioned, by November of 79, that whole first wave of the local scene was in its last throes and really split into 3 camps. As the 70s turned into the 80s, a lot of the original scenesters either decided that, they'd had their rebellion moment and wanted to retire to the burbs and were done with all this. Second, there was another segment, mostly of the drink first, music second variety. They kind of joined in with this new wave that was coming in. And I found the second wave, a lot of it was sort of, the idea was, I missed 77 the first time around, and now I want to slavishly recreate it forever. And it's like, no thanks. Then there was a third camp who decided to see punk simply as a restarting point and an inspiration infusion or palate cleanser, as it were, on the road to whole new realms and possibilities, and in terms of how to view things looking back and going forward. But again, the focus on new forward, new sounds, new experiences, new ways of creating and hearing music. And I was firmly in the third camp. I'm too much of an individualist to toe any hegemonic culture line for too long. And I had a really rich musical background. Even though I was still at a certain age, I had been consciously and unconsciously absorbing music for a decade and a half before this, unlike most of the people my age, where they really probably would have only been kind of getting into music a few years before. And I'd already had this appetite for strangeness and newness that had come from years of all the music that had come before as well. And I wasn't interested in being stuck in 3-chord Ramalama land forever. And, while basic Ramones-ish rock will always be dear to my heart, and quite frankly, today it's in short supply, it's only one of the many, many, many musical food groups that interest me and continue to interest me. And by this point, the whole sort of first wave of punk was sort of, okay, I've done this. Where do we go next? My musical horizons were about to start exploding in all directions in the years ahead. So whereas you had these new traditionalists in the scene who were starting to champion the, ultimately conservative flag bearing of stuff like the UK Subs and the Exploited, I was being blown away by a whole new, far more experimental contingent of acts, which were soon to be labeled post-punk, namely Public Image or PIL, The Slits, Joy Division, The Gang of Four, Susie and the Banshees. Of course, they'd been around for a while, but just did their debut in '78. The Cure, and also the recent developments with the Talking Heads and Wire. And a lot of these acts came as an affront to the sort of beer and punk and four on the floor and that's it sort of crowd, in the same way that the Sex Pistols had been an affront to the AOR masses. I'd already had the past. Now I wanted the future. Bring on the 80s. Well, that's it for episode 13 of mylifeinconcert.com. Tune in next time for episode 14, my first gig of the 1980s, namely Ireland's Boomtown Rats, who had been an obsession of mine over the previous 2.5 years since I'd picked up their debut 45 in the UK in 77. And with opening act, BB Gabor, they played that big arena in the city South End I was talking about earlier, London Gardens, returning to the scene of the 1978 Bob Seger concert that I revisited in episode 7. And also, the next episode marks the return of my pal, Special Guests. Yes. He appeared in my Ramones episode number 3, and actually he'll be appearing in quite a number of the episodes coming up. So he was living in London at the time. He's now in Leeds, UK, and he'll be offering his memories of the show. We didn't know each other at the time. We met a couple of years later, but he was at the show as well, and he's got some wonderful memories to share. Just a reminder to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We have our My Life in Concert YouTube channel featuring related vids I've shot or digitized along with versions of the podcast episodes. And also, too, I'd like to mention there's a video playlist that I've got up of bands from sort of the London region from that era. I also have a Spotify account under my pen name Various Artists with playlists related to some of the episodes. I've got one up now. It's really just an overview of what I was listening for that year for anyone who may be in any way interested. I don't know. It's there. And of course, there's the mylifeinconcert.com website. And if you were at this or any other gig, certainly feel free to share your memories. Thanks so much to everyone for listening and hope you enjoyed. This is your host, Various Artists, signing off. Take care, and we'll meet up at the next gig. Bye for now.